Welcome to Co-Opinions. I'm your host Josh, and today I have Nick with me.
Hey, Josh.
So let's go ahead and get right into it. Nick, what did you play this last week?
I've been playing Yakuza 5. I think on the last episode I was recording with you, I mentioned how I was a escaped prison convict and I was hunting deer and bear and other creatures in the mountains. I took a abrupt tonal shift with that game after that chapter, and I became a pop idol. I am now a 16-year-old pop idol.
So wait, in this game you've been in prison, hunting animals, and now you're a pop idol.
Yes, although different characters for the hunting and the prison stint as well as versus the pop idol tour.
See, now that's an important distinction because I did not realize you were switching characters, so I was wondering how an ex-con managed to make that transition.
And I suppose this is a good time to talk about that aspect of the game. Yakuza 5 involves switching between 5 different playable characters. You start off as Kiryu Kazuma, the protagonist for the Yakuza series. Then you're Taiga Saejima, who was introduced in Yakuza 4 as a key character. Now I am Haruka Sawamura. She is the adopted daughter of Kiryu Kazuma. My host Josh is giving me a bit of a look, so I'll focus on the actual point here before I start drowning him in Japanese names.
I'm glad you knew that was the problem.
So I'm now a pop idol, and that was in a very abrupt tone of pace. I've gone from running around these cities and getting in these random brawling encounters like a good Streets of Rage style game in 3D, and now I'm essentially doing rhythm game things to go ahead and dance my way to success in the pop idol world. It's been enjoyable. There have been some strange bits to it though. My manager told me recently about her tragic sob story as this dragon lady opened up to me. And she started talking about how she had an abortion and she didn't tell her husband, and how that was the beginning of the end of her marriage and the end of her career. And my 16-year-old character, Haruka Sawamura, as the sad music is playing as they ride in this cab after they've just had this wonderful evening together bonding, hearing these stories, just kind of has that blank look on her face. They didn't do a good job of the uncanny valley for trying to animate for those facial emotions or expressions. It's just, yeah, you had an abortion? Okay, yeah, then your husband left you? I was pretty drunk as I was playing this, and I just remember, even at that moment, something seemed socially inappropriate for this. Like, this was too grave of a subject, being treated just like, oh yeah, abortion. These happen all the time. Just matter of course. Dr. Fetus Deletus in the house.
Did it at least let you do the whole give feedback thing, like nod gravely or smile chipper?
Sadly not. That would have been a nice addition.
That's boggling. So where do you even go from here?
In the game?
Yeah.
Well, shortly thereafter, my manager committed suicide, except it was actually a frame thing, and it's not suicide, and the Yakuza is involved. And you're seeing how this game is written for 13 to 6-year-olds, minus the abortion angle.
I mean, I'm not even going to touch that one.
I should have led with this because I'm not sure how you transition from abortion to anything with video games, but it's been interesting with the new different kinds of side quests. You know, you mentioned that kind of give feedback kind of thing. The side quests for the others might involve kind of helping people in distress. Mm-hmm. For this, instead, it involves kind of building your media career, so going on television shows and doing interviews. One particularly interesting side quest I thought they had was you essentially joined a comedy duo, and you had to select the responses as a straight person for the actual comedian in the comedy bit. Well, I've encountered some difficulties with that because the Yakuza 5 game was not actually translated with voice acting. It was just translated with text. So trying to nail the timing around press the button to choose the right response with the exact right comedic timing is very difficult with a language you don't understand, with different intonations where you don't know where the joke is actually going to end. I spent about an hour trying to nail that one down before I decided it probably wasn't going to be worth my time.
Did you go online and see that other people were having this issue? Or
I didn't bother doing any research into that. I just decided I would go enjoy many other multitude of side quests that were in the game. So that's primarily what I've been playing this week. Other than that, I'd be Final Fantasy Explorers, but I'll get to that a little bit later in the episode when I talk about underwhelming final boss encounters. What have you been playing, Josh?
Sounds great. The big thing that I've been playing has been Xenoblade Chronicles X, but before I get on to that, I did start playing Rhythm Thief and the Emperor's Treasure. Yeah, you'd played that years ago. And you said it was okay. It has kind of a cliffhanger ending, which was surprising given the tepid response to it. It's working as a filler game. Nothing about it seems particularly outstanding. It really seems like they just cribbed Professor Layton's style and they put a bunch of rhythm games into it, which, do you agree with that?
I 100% agree with that. I think instead of trying to take that English professor type of feel that you had with Professor Layton, they tried to go with this French thief angle. So I give them some credit as far as trying to make it original while still kind of clearly paying an homage. I think my main issue with it were that some of the gyromatic controls, I think that you refer to them for the motion sensor where you tilt the machine, Those sort of stages were very frustrating for me personally. I don't know if you've encountered any of those yet.
The only one of those I've currently encountered was there was a mini game where you're supposed to throw food to your dog. And you have to tilt it to the left, center, or right to catch the food with the dog. And I did pretty okay with it, but I have a fundamental problem with those kinds of games because they go, grab the food, don't grab the garbage. My question is, why is the owner even throwing garbage at the dog? Like, there's not an outside factor here. It'd just be like if you were throwing something to your dog and one of the times you decide to throw a barbell. Like, why would you do that? You see the issue that I don't...
You're an abusive pet owner in this game.
I guess. And that was the other thing about it, was for people who have played Professor Layton, and I don't know how much this kid recurs, there is a child detective I encountered at one point, but it's just Luke. It's Luke with a soccer ball from Professor Layton. And I don't know if he comes back. You said it ends on a cliffhanger. I don't really know where this plot is going right now, because as of now, I just entered chapter 5. I found out that my dad is working for the resurrected Napoleon. Do they explain that at all?
This will be revealed, and as part of this entire cliffhanger, finale, all of that, you are seeing the central conflict being set up.
Okay. It's only like a 10-chapter game, so I'm not super concerned. I'm also not super invested because I got it as part of the Humble Bundle. So I think on average I paid about $1.30 for this game. So
how are you enjoying the music so far, and for the rhythm game aspect?
The music is pretty enjoyable. One of the complaints I saw when I looked up reviews was some of the songs were forgettable. And when you have a game built solely around songs, and where the songs aren't they're a driving point because it's a rhythm game, but it's not rhythm heaven. In rhythm heaven, the songs had to be catchy and they didn't have to stand in with the story. They could just be complete and total nonsense. In this, they have to tie in some capacity. The rhythm game I just beat was skipping stones in the sewer. There was nothing particularly memorable because what's memorable about that? There's kind of a disconnect because you're a very musical guy in a very non-musical world, which is weird to me. I would think they would try to make it a much more vibrant world, I guess. I don't know, I just feel like there should be more song in general. I'm not saying people shouldn't be singing, but at the same time, the only time there seems to be music is when you're dancing behind statues.
I think that's a fair criticism. You mentioned jumping across the pond stones. Another example that comes to mind is like climbing this large staircase near the finale. And to your point, there's kind of a nice fine contrast to make of making the music fit in organically with the story and not just going whole hog of, hey, I'm now Oliver and company wandering through the streets of New York. Why should I worry?
Yeah, I like where they tried to do this. I had some slight problems near the beginning. Whenever you have to do a slide command, that's real iffy on anything. I know that Rhythm Heaven for DS, the primary way you did the rhythm stuff was with the slide command. And that's real hit or miss. So whenever they have it in this game, nah. It's not as bad as gyroscopic controls. Now that you've said that, I'm not looking forward to that at all. Gyroscopic controls almost single-handedly killed the final boss fight in Mario and Luigi Dream Team, was it? That was some garbage.
I think where you'll encounter the gyroscopic controls, and where I at least had frustration in this game, was essentially kind of like a boxing kind of duel sort of thing. So you have to go ahead and do a sharp tilt to the left, essentially. I never found that I had the level of control that I wanted to have. I kind of limped through the main game story while getting very agitated.
And that kind of brings to another point. I don't like how they distribute what you get for getting these better ranks. You get 1 medal for getting a C rank, 2 for getting a B, 3 for getting an A. It's not a lot. It's a small amount. And you need 20 to buy anything. You can find 5 in any place from clicking on a random spot, a la Professor Layton. Just click on somewhere on the map, you'll find a present, 5, 10, 15, 20 medals. Why am I trying to do better? I don't know. It's a frustration. I paid $1.30 for this game. So it's not the end of the world. I'll beat it at some point, but there's nothing driving me behind it. I'm looking...
Other than the cliffhanger.
Yeah, but I haven't got to it yet.
Assuming you care about it once you hit that point. That's always the danger of a cliffhanger for a new franchise.
Yeah, I'm not super worried about that. But to go back to XCX real fast, I am currently in Chapter 5, and I'm not liking how progression works in this game. I feel like they needlessly pad the time between the chapters by saying, here's everything you could possibly do. And as you move toward the next chapter, you're supposed to organically build up what you're supposed to accomplish. You're supposed to build up these relationships, your level, what you're doing, but it doesn't feel like a real sense of progression. It's real loose. And that's not what I like in my RPG. I don't feel like I'm accomplishing anything.
It's interesting. You get the sense that they've accomplished what they set out to design. It's just that what they've set out to design isn't necessarily what appealed to you. It kind of goes back to the point you were making in last week's episode with Brent around a review of if a game is very technically proficient, is very tightly designed, but it just doesn't speak to you, how do you even necessarily quantify a score for a game of that nature?
Exactly. Like right now it's feeling a lot like a 7 to me, just because the progression's real loose and I love the scale of the world. But you told me before this podcast you don't really get to enjoy the scale until chapter 9, the end of chapter 9. And this isn't a 12 chapter game. I would love to fly around this world right now, but that's not going to happen for another 30 hours.
If that.
Oh my god. So, and another thing that's a frustration is the fact that you're not playing as the main character, which is a frustration because you have to have this main character, Elma. She's the one who wakes you up at the beginning. You have to have her in every story mission. So why is your character even there? And I believe you told me outside of recording once that it becomes apparent near the end why you're there. But for the first, 80 hours of gameplay, I just have to question why they even bother having you exist if all you're doing is observing. So the game, it's okay. I'm not regretting it by any stretch of the imagination, but Xenoblade Chronicles set a very high bar, and you warned me X was not going to live up to that bar, but I had to keep thinking it would. It reminds me of when I got Yoshi's New Island. Like, oh, this is going to be better than the reviews said. It's not, so...
I'm sorry to hear that, Josh.
It gets better by the end, right?
I enjoyed it very much, I'll say that much. I think as far as your specific concerns and it living up to Xenoblade Chronicles, I would say that it's something entirely different and it can't really be that linear comparison. I think that's partially a problem with branding and giving it that name. It borrows some similar aspects of Xenoblade Chronicles, but is different enough to really be its own new entity.
Yeah, well, it's not different enough to not have the no pawn in it. Ugh. Anyway.
I take it you don't like Tatsu.
Who likes Tatsu?
No one.
Exactly. So moving on to our first topic of the day, I was going to discuss the Toys to Life genre. You are familiar with the Toys to Life genre?
Amiibo, Skylander, things of that nature?
Correct. For anybody not familiar with it, the Toys to Life genre uses figurines or something analogous to figurines, and you read them into the game medium via near-field communication. For Amiibos, there's a little reader on the Wii U gamepad. For Skylanders, it comes with a little stand that you touch on it. Same with Disney Infinity, and recently, last year, they came out with Lego Dimensions. I did some research on this, and it turned out the Toys to Life genre existed in the late 90s. I had no idea about this, but it was very short-lived because the technology just wasn't there yet. It said that they interacted with VHS and select computer games. I can't imagine that a lot of the demographic that would want these toys to life, which are primarily young children, correct? Mm-hmm. That's what you would agree with. They probably weren't playing computer games extensively in the late 90s, were they? I mean, there was young kid games like Math Blaster and the Leapfrog games, and there were the games like System Shock.
Correct.
There wasn't really an in-between there. So it just feels like it wasn't there. And then from 2007 to 2011, what was it, UB Funkies?
Yes.
My guess is they just didn't have the market presence that would be necessary to succeed.
That's a great point. A lot of these other ones that we talked about with Skylanders and Amiibos are very ubiquitous. If you were to do some polling around that for it, have you heard of this brand? I think you'd see recognition numbers greater than any of these others that kind of started off dipping the toes into that field.
Exactly. So that brings us to the Skylanders point. Do you think Skylanders, that's the first one anybody ever really heard of, it's still going strong today, do you think it would have succeeded had it not started out as Spyro Skylanders?
I think Spyro Skylanders was a really smart move on their part. So you're taking that game franchise and you're essentially creating those toys around a 15-year-old game. I believe Spyro 1 came out in 98, 99, somewhere in that time frame. So 12 to 15 years. So with that, you have a great opportunity to go ahead and target people who essentially had been exposed to these things when they were very little, let's say 5 or 6, and are now essentially 17 or 18. People who have grown up with the video game hobby and started playing more mature games, but are now kind of dipping their toes back into those things they enjoyed from their childhood. you have the ability to get people who are looking for something to get for their children, who remember seeing the Spyro commercials when they were teenagers and now have little kids at home and are like, oh, hey, this is a game that was popular when I was a kid. You had a base to build off of there from a brand recognition perspective for people that were involved in the video game scene. So I think that was a very smart move.
And the brand recognition rolled into the fact that these parents who knew it now needed to buy toys for their kids who were playing games, and these were toys they liked, and they kept building on functionality. I know they came out with Giants, they came out with vehicles, they've come out with a lot of iterations. After Skylanders, Disney Infinity was the next Toys to Life thing that jumped on the bandwagon. And it actually was canceled, if you heard that in our last podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Within the last 2 weeks, Disney Interactive shuttered and took Infinity with it, which was really curious because it really seemed like between Marvel, Star Wars, and just normal Disney properties, they had a crazy strong background going for them. I know they'd just gotten up to Disney 3.0, so I thought that was curious that they chose to close because wasn't there just, you don't follow this at all, do you?
Which aspect are you talking about me following?
Did you know they were up to 3.0 first off?
I did not.
Did you know that they were releasing Star Wars Disney Infinity?
I did not.
That's what I thought was so interesting. Since they kept acquiring things, they were having Avengers 2 stuff come out. They had Black Panther from Captain America Civil War. They were still putting stuff out up until the very end.
I think that's the interesting part of one of those conglomerates that you have, though, is essentially that you may have the success of these individual properties, but one, you have that focus essentially on sales growth, not just being financially successful, but seeing that steady escalation that's going to lead to an increased profit rate and increased returns for your shareholders. But then you also have where you may have individual success, but then have the large failure that essentially sinks a lot of your company. THQ, the publisher's bankruptcy, comes to mind, where if you look at a lot of the games they were putting out, then you had a lot of successful properties, but you had the Draw game that they had essentially with that Draw tablet.
Yeah.
It was a large success on one platform, and they tried to go ahead and bring that out more broadly, and they essentially overestimated how much they would be able to sell and had an excessive amount of supply on hand without much of demand to fill it.
I remember that, yeah. That was a train wreck. The thing about the Disney Infinity was I really thought they would continue leveraging it because both Skylanders and Disney Infinity, they had games that were centered around these figures, which transitions into the next NFC.
I guess one quick point on that about the games designed around the figures, it may have been something where for Disney, then they looked at it and said, why are we investing all of this money into the expensive software development process to go ahead and unlock things in these properties when these brands are valuable enough in and of themselves that we can just sell the actual action figures as an action figure without that being a value add plus.
I actually thought the exact opposite, when that every year you only have to put out one Disney Infinity game, but you could put out, let's say, 20 figures. So instead of having to sink the development costs in for 4 games a year, if you were doing something on the individual properties, you only have to do 1 game a year, and then you sell 20 times 12, 240, 4 games worth of figurines that are significantly easier to code for because you just pop them in. That was my thought.
Okay.
But going from games that are specifically designed for these NFC Toys to Life to Nintendo's foray, and this is where it gets interesting. With Smash Wii U, what was that? Was that just Smash Brothers? Yeah, it was just Smash
Brothers for the Wii U and 3DS.
Wii U and 3DS. They decided to come out with Amiibo, which the lion's share of these Amiibo are based on characters within Smash Brothers, and the functionality is admittedly limited. People always questioned why Nintendo was doing this because they didn't really see the functionality. As it has continued, you really haven't seen a ton of functionality, truth be told. We have Mario Party Amiibos, Splatoon Amiibos, Animal Crossing Amiibos. A Shovel Knight Amiibo, to me, has been the strongest one. It has given new abilities to unlock, new costumes to unlock, new items. That's been the best Amiibo, personally. I own almost all of the Smash Brothers Amiibo, and I don't think I've scanned any of them in 2 years. Feels like Nintendo went straight for my nostalgia, and they got it. I feel like an average consumer would have been had, like if it was a child who really liked Nintendo stuff, they would have just taken their money because nobody's going to use all these.
I think what's interesting with this is the contrast to the Nintendo e-reader on the Game Boy Advance back in 2003 and 2004. With those, you have a card, you scan the card, and now you have an extra stage in Super Mario Bros. 3. So that's more functionality and less actual tangible physical thing. Here, then you have kind of the reverse where it becomes, oh, hey, I got an action figure, and to your point, it doesn't really do a whole lot. I personally, as a consumer, like that because it lets me opt out of these things. It's not like I'm dependent on them as like some sort of a DLC pass or something like that for content I want to enjoy.
And Nintendo had talked about also having card versions of this. For Animal Crossing, there is cards. People actually pushed back on it because they want the extraneous pieces of plastic. They look cool. I really like the way they look. But if it was going to be a DLC gate, that's what people were pushing back really hard against. Interesting note, Skylanders recently announced that they were going to be adding cards to their repertoire of NFC that they made available.
You figure with that, the initial cost for developing the software is basically a fixed input. And then from there, if you can go ahead and distribute these to people, then it's all gravy for you. So if you're selling a card as a $5 pack, that card is cheaper to manufacture than the actual piece of plastic. It's almost no different than a gift card where, all right, you have a little card thing that you scan and now you just have the points and now you just have the content.
Well, an important thing to note on that is that the cards come in sealed foil packs that are randomized. So if there's 50 cards and there's 7 card packs, that doesn't mean you buy 8 packs and you get all of them.
They're taking a Magic the Gathering collectible card game kind of route. Way to get the cash.
The Animal Crossing amiibo and the game associated with it look like garbage anyway, so I won't be buying it. So let's go ahead and transition to what you wanted to talk about this week, which was...
I wanted to talk about underwhelming final boss fights, Josh. I mentioned that I beat Final Fantasy Explorers recently. I think I spoke about that game the last time I was on the podcast about how it was a Monster Hunt style spin-off for the Final Fantasy series, a 3DS game.
Mm-hmm.
For this game, you essentially are exploring this island and you are trying to gather crystals. And in the process of doing so, then you are fighting these Eidolons, these iconic Final Fantasy summons, Ramuh, Ifrit, and so on. Well, going into the final boss fight, then you have this objective. It's on your world map the entire game as you're exploring the outskirts of the island, that there's a grand crystal in the middle of the island. Everything is focused on getting to that grand crystal and unlocking its powers. As I accepted this final quest, then I kind of thought to myself, well, how much time do I need to set aside for this? For a Final Fantasy game, for one of those RPGs, you usually go into this kind of thing saying, all right, I better go ahead and have 2 or 3 hours, something like that, because there's going to be a lot of content for this final dungeon, this final boss fight, all the things around it for a Final Fantasy game.
Right.
As I venture into the crystal, then I am in this area called World's End. Again, adding to my theory about, all right, this is going to be a major undertaking that I'm going on here.
Right.
A quick note here, I guess, on format for these other kind of things, because they warned me ahead of time I was going to be fighting a new kind of summon creature inside of this thing. These previous summon battles I'd have would generally have a format where you venture into a dungeon area, you explore through 3 or 4 different dungeon screens, and then you get to that boss of that area. You're now fighting Ifrit, you defeat Ifrit, you go home, the success music plays, everything's happy.
All right.
For this, I thought they would kind of double down on World's End and have World's End be this massive, sprawling labyrinth. All right, you're at World's End, map 6, map 7, map 8. Just have time go by. Maybe have some mid-bosses in this large dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
None of that happened.
Well...
I got to World's End 3, I got to the end of World's End 3, and then there's the boss. Okay, that's fine. You know, World's End wasn't a very compelling dungeon. It was very pretty, running around this little crystal area. I fought a couple of different random monsters that I had fought outside of the giant crystal. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Fighting this final boss, also extremely underwhelming. It was less challenging than other summons such as Odin and Bahamut. Odin had a supercharged attack where once you started storing up his power, you had to get out of his range because he would use the Zansetsuken to go ahead and kill your entire party.
That was his deal, though.
Absolutely. Bahamut, you had Mega Flare. Bahamut storing up his power, you get the hell away from Bahamut because he's going to do 9,999 damage to you and kill you. Therion was the name of this final boss. It wasn't a particularly impressive design. There wasn't anything noteworthy to it as there was for some of the new summons that were added into the game. It wasn't particularly powerful and it didn't take very long to beat. Well, no big deal. This must just be a first form or something like that. Nope, that was his final form. The entire process to beat this final game was essentially no different than any of the other summon fights that I had encountered through the rest of the game. This final boss wasn't aesthetically interesting or mechanically interesting in any way, shape, or form. And after that, a little 15-20 second cinematics showed to go ahead and show my character returning to town and all the townspeople waving happily, and then the credits rolled.
Are you serious?
I was very disappointed for a Final Fantasy game.
Did you miss something? Did you
Nope.
look it up?
There was nothing that I missed. This is the ending for the game. Now, that story aspect is something where, all right, the story is kind of a light thing for this game as compared to the Final Fantasy game, so I knew the ending wasn't going to be some overwhelming tour de force. But for the final boss, I think I deserved a better final boss than that. I am disappointed there was not a form change for this Japanese RPG game.
And you bring up an interesting point with over, 15 years of Final Fantasy under our belts at this point? A little more, a little less, depending on who you talk to. Is it weird that only one form for a final boss can be considered disappointing? Do you think if it had had another form that it possibly would have been more interesting? Because I know I've played some games, I go into it thinking, well, I bet it'll be more interesting. Like I am under-preparing myself. I'm preparing myself for disappointment. But then if there's not a second form, then I'm kind of...
It's like the appetizer to the main course, is you're kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to go into this with the expectation this will kind of warm me up for my skill set here. It might show me some of the abilities that the main boss is going to use in a more aggressive form to let me get used to the mechanics for this fight's design. I think that that's a fair approach to have for going into final bosses for JRPGs.
So what are some other disappointing final bosses? I know I have a small list here, but what would you consider some other disappointing final bosses you've encountered?
I think another great example would be The Legend of Grimrock. So The Legend of Grimrock was a PC RPG that was trying to focus on getting the nostalgia that people had for the old Eye of the Beholder style of Dungeons & Dragons games where you're exploring a dungeon labyrinth, solving puzzles, doing the usual RPG shindig as you level up and go ahead and allocate skills for your classes. Mm-hmm. So for this game, then you had a lot of very enjoyable fights as you're crawling through this dungeon, and then you get to the bottom, and there's just this giant mechanical cube, and it's trying to crush you. So the entire final boss fight just revolves around dodging this cube as it tries to crush you, and then attacking this cube thing.
Yeah.
It was not pleasant, especially for something that had so much cleverness as far as the puzzles go. I was hoping for some sort of a puzzle boss fight. I was hoping for some sort of massive monster that would really kind of task me to see what way I had kind of designated skills for my party, what they were. To have those skills for my party to see, all right, how can I make full use of these to mitigate this boss's combat abilities? Instead, having every moment essentially be a real-time process of dodging it for a game where you have the ability to kind of pause and customize and think and strategize for how you're going to handle the attacks. That was another underwhelming boss fight for me. I have one or two others that I want to talk about, but why don't you talk about one of the underwhelming boss fights you've had, Josh?
So one of the underwhelming boss fights that I had, and this really just kind of capped off an underwhelming game, so I'm not sure how much it should count, was the Evil Within. The Evil Within cribbed so much from Resident Evil, which makes sense because both were made by Shinji Mikami. Is that?
That's correct.
Fantastic. I felt like everything about that was underwhelming. The fact that you had the Keeper, who was a guy who had a safe for a head, he carried around a meat tenderizer. He just seemed like a rip-off Pyramid Head. You had the legitimately creepy girl with all the arms that crawled around really fast. She just looked like a Ring rip-off. And then when you got up to the final boss, it was this giant amalgamation. I didn't even care at that point. It was supposed to be scary, all cerebral in your head. And then I go, it's not over yet because... And then they gave me the rocket launcher and I go, now I know it's over. You just knew. It was so underwhelming because everything was so broadcast about it.
When you say amalgamation, I'm envisioning like a beef stew of horror tropes, essentially.
It was. It was a big crawling monstrosity that had scary things popping out of it. And you were like inside the protagonist's brain or something. And that's what was more amazing, was how it was so underwhelming, given the fact it was so weird and you didn't know what was going on. I just didn't care at that point. So, is it still underwhelming if the game was underwhelming? I feel like it almost shouldn't count at that point.
It was essentially like a golf course where they're getting a double bogey the entire way through. At that point, it just becomes, all right, you're not going to be doing well, and you're going to continue to disappoint.
Pretty much. But another one, and I'm curious if this should count as underwhelming, is in the Assassin's Creed games. The Assassin's Creed games are always supposed to be about stealth killing stuff. But in Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Unity, you basically have to fight a guy. Unity is better than Syndicate, and this is the only time you'll ever hear Unity is better than Syndicate, in that you can actually stealth the final boss, sort of. But having to focus on the combat whatsoever in these games underscores what you're trying to accomplish with these games. They're a type of game that really shouldn't have final bosses, which there are some other games we can talk about that shouldn't have had final bosses, but they did.
I think one that comes to mind for me is one that should have had a final boss in my mind is Sonic the Hedgehog, actually.
Okay.
For that one, then, Sonic the Hedgehog, as you go through the scrap brain zone, you're this big robotic city after kind of exploring all of these areas. You start off you're on the outskirts of the city in Act 1. In Act 2, you move to the actual mechanical heart of this city, and then you drop through the ground into this labyrinth for Act 3. And with this Labyrinth for Act 3, you're kind of climbing your way back up. Robotnik has successfully trapped you and you're trying to get out. Well, then when you get to the actual final boss fight, then I personally was hoping to have something that was really, really exciting, get the adrenaline pumping. Instead, he's dodging you, jumping from elevator to elevator in his hidden little lair as you go ahead and just try to dodge these elevators so they don't crush you and dodge the electrical sparks that he goes ahead and fires.
Well, do you remember the trick to that boss fight? At the far right, he doesn't have a crusher. So if you just wait at the far right, he can never crush you and you just have to dodge the electricity.
That sounds very, very easy. I've never really had too much trouble with it.
It's not a hard boss fight, but it made an easy boss fight even easier.
I do appreciate how they learned from that, though, because for Sonic the Hedgehog 2, playing that as a 6-year-old and getting to the Death Egg Zone and fighting Eggman's gigantic machine there, that was a delightful memory for me.
Well, and you only had, a frame of clearance to hit him above his little spike hands?
That's correct.
That was a brutal boss fight, especially since, did you have rings in that fight?
You did not. You had to ace that one perfectly.
And that was even after Silver Sonic, which is an important distinction, as Wikipedia once taught you.
That's correct. I tried to go ahead and edit it and say that it was Metal Sonic, and within a couple of minutes, someone popped back in to go ahead and say that it was Silver Sonic. I do appreciate they did go ahead and take my edit as a good faith edit. They thought my heart was in the right place as I edited the Sonic the Hedgehog Wikipedia.
And knowing the Sonic fandom, it could have been a lot more venomous than that.
Absolutely. But speaking of those kind of underwhelming final boss fights, Josh, and particularly these kind of spin-offs, Final Fantasy Explorers was a spin-off. I think that's a good segue to our next topic, which is series spin-offs in particular. So this was one of many examples where Final Fantasy has had these sort of spin-offs. Do you want to talk a little bit more about other spin-offs in this series, Josh?
So if we want to go towards, you said this was kind of a dungeon crawly type of spin-off. Do you remember Crystal Explorers? Was that what it was called? There was a GameCube game. And I remember when it came out, I was in sophomore year of high school. I was so excited because it was a Final Fantasy game and I was naive and young. And this was the type of game meant to be played with other people. Did you play it?
I never did.
It was a kind of game where you needed the GBA connector cable, which nobody had, and you needed 3 other friends to play with you because playing it by yourself, it just wasn't enjoyable. They expected you to have multiple people providing multiple types of offense, defense, and support. The whole goal of the game was to fill up your chalice and then take it back to your village, and then your village would be protected for another year. And as the years progressed, the enemies got harder and harder. You were supposed to get to the final area and defeat the source of all the evil before it got too far. I couldn't do it by myself. I didn't have enough manpower. So I got up to year 12, and then I couldn't kill anything anymore. It just really wasn't enjoyable because it was a dramatic departure that I wasn't expecting.
Mandatory multiplayer in general is something I'm not a fan of for a series like that where most of the games are allowed to just be done through single player.
If we're staying on Final Fantasy, they've had some other interesting spin-offs. If we're going to go with what I consider to be the most eclectic, I would say Erdgree's God Bless the Ring, which was the fighter on PlayStation. Did you ever play that?
I never did. I remember seeing screenshots of it, but I never had the pleasure of playing it. Was it in fact a pleasure?
It was not. I'm glad you phrased it like that. Some people liked it more than others. It didn't try hard enough to me. It was a game that banked too much on what they had. This was a game in high school. If I had told you you could play as Sephiroth in a fighting game, I think I would have nutted in middle school. But when I actually played it, Sephiroth was underwhelming. Cloud, all the characters were underwhelming. It had a fixed camera angle. It was like if they took the Tekken camera and then took it back to a fixed camera angle. It played poorly, in my opinion. It played poorly. The character selection was underwhelming. Everything you wanted them to do, they just didn't.
This is sounding disappointing for a 3D fighter, even for its time. I'm thinking about series like Bloody Roar that did the 3D fighting thing in a very enjoyable fashion. It's essentially failing against any of its competition.
And that was the thing. It felt like it was so set on using its pedigree to not have to worry about making a good game that if you were at a point where you could critically evaluate games, then you could easily see all the weakness. Now, I haven't played it in over a decade. We might get some feedback saying all the things I did wrong. I played it when I was maybe 14, and I've never been good at fighting games. Anybody who knows me, I've tried. I'm not great. So maybe there was a better way to do it. But held up against other 3D fighters, even Dead or Alive was out at that time. And that was still a better fighting game. Ghibli's aside. Do you have more Final Fantasy, or do you want to move on to a different
Well,
franchise?
I think Revenant Wings is one that should be called out. So Revenant Wings was a DS spin-off of the Final Fantasy XII series. It was an RTS. They took the best part about Final Fantasy XII was watching everyone basically shit all over Vaughn at every opportunity, mocking him for being an idiotic, annoying child. Which is good, because realistically, this is how we learn not to be idiotic, annoying children, is to have people older than us rebuke us for the stupid things that we do. So this decided to just focus on Vaughn, and Vaughn didn't learn so much when people were calling him an idiot in his last big adventure.
They were outright calling him an idiot, too. There were points where people were calling him stupid.
The best part about that in Final Fantasy XII is when he asks how old Fran is, and the entire party just turns and looks at him like he's just shit on her chest. That was very, very delightful for me. They all just kind of walk off shaking their heads, talking about how rude he is, how he should show a little bit more sense, and so on. And you're just left after that cutscene of, all right, let's go along. Vaughn is an idiot. And we all give a big thumbs up.
Yeah.
So in this game, we're focused on Vaughn, and we're doing the real-time strategy game on the DS. I actually appreciate the game, even though I didn't enjoy it. What I appreciated was the ambition here. I appreciated trying to do something like that with the touchscreen to go ahead and control those units. My personal big challenge and why I dropped the game was I found that I was underleveled for particular types of encounters, and I didn't feel like I had a good way to go ahead and try and grind to give myself a bit of an edge for those encounters. This was a solid 7 of 10 game if I had to go ahead and try and toss an arbitrary number against it. It was certainly mechanically competent. I thought the story could have gone some interesting places, although I didn't see it to conclusion. But it was not actually something that I deeply enjoyed. Did you ever play it, Josh?
I didn't play it because I knew one guy I worked with told me that it focused on Vaughn and Pinello, and I go, but they were the parts of the game that I completely cut out.
Pinello had a great butt, there's that.
She did have a great butt for, late PS2 era graphics, but you know who had a better butt in that game?
Fran.
Bam! Nailed it. But wasn't she... No, she was in Final Fantasy War of the Lions. Tactics War of the Lions. No, Balthier was in that. Not that I ever played all the way through that either. I never touched it because of the way you described it and the way my coworker described it. I enjoyed 12 so much I didn't want to potentially pollute that with playing this game, which seemed like it was going to be a Final Fantasy Tactics, but then it wasn't.
Another series with spin-offs I think is worth discussing would be Sonic the Hedgehog. So Sonic the Hedgehog has Sonic Brotherhood, with Sonic Dark Chronicles of Brotherhood. I may be messing up the subtitles.
Oh, is that the RPG one?
That's correct. This was the DS RPG that was developed by BioWare that included that ability to go ahead and do dialogue selections, essentially, for whether you said thumbs up or thumbs down. It was interesting that it kind of pulled from like the Sonic Adventure and the mainline Sonic series, but also had elements of the Sonic the Hedgehog comics, like with the emphasis on the echidnas and the amount of echidnas that were out there. Some have speculated that that's part of the development hell that the sequel... Well, I say development hell. The sequel was never confirmed, which is unfortunate because it too, like Rhythm Thief, decided to end on a cliffhanger. Now, this was an interesting game. It kind of tried to do the Mario RPG style kind of thing where you have the timed attacks. It was a DS game, so you'd have the stylus and you'd have things like try and tap the circle as fast as you can to get enough taps in. The ability to go ahead and do a little circular rotation. I do want to go ahead and have a note here. Josh scribbled a little note to me that just said, thank you, Ken Penders. So thank you, Ken Penders, for your long, drawn-out lawsuit to try and reclaim your intellectual property. If any of our listeners have not seen the 3D renders for Ken Penders' vision of the future for the Echidna race, let's just say that it's a downfall that has not been seen since about the fall of the Third Reich. Let's use the Holocaust analogies here.
Oh my god, I gotta say that Ken Penders, when you said echidnas, I can never think echidnas without thinking that comic you linked me, which basically ends with Knuckles proclaiming up into the sky, "Thank you, Ken Penders," and then there's just a picture of him in the sky.
That was delightful. I'll have to pull that up and we can add it as a comment onto the downloadable for the podcast.
That is a good idea, and I support it.
Other than Sonic Brotherhood, which I found to be an enjoyable game, it was a good kind of child's RPG for as far as those dialogue for the branching options. Kind of the Mario RPG style of real-time / turn-based hybrid gameplay was enjoyable. Another spin-off that was not to be in the Sonic the Hedgehog series would be Sonic Mars. This was an interesting period following the launch of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and 3 during that time period, where Sega was trying to explore new directions for the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Sonic Mars was going to be a 3-2X game. The developers for it tried to show it off to Yuji Naka, who was notoriously protective of Sonic the Hedgehog of a character. And Yuji Naka essentially just told them very, very sternly and coldly, good luck, and then just stormed off.
Woo.
So In other news, that game never came to pass.
Fancy that.
It's interesting when you have those creators and how they really shouldn't be given credit for the entirety of the success, since it takes an entire software team to go ahead and make these games. It's interesting when you have these sort of director-type individuals who feel that emotional attachment that I am the one. This is my character, my franchise. I think that's an unhealthy attitude.
It's an unhealthy attitude, and as a quick aside to that, something that I'm noticing a lot now in this connected information age is you're seeing a lot of developers when a game comes out. Two that come to mind are Supergiant Games, who want to make very clear when any game comes out, Bastion, Transistor, or Pyre is about to come out, that the entire team gets credit, not just one particular person. And when The Witness came out with Jonathan Blow, he even noted in every review that he goes, don't credit this just to me. A lot of people put in a lot of time for this. While I may have spearheaded it and I may consider it my baby of sorts, other people had insight into this.
It's interesting, where with movies, and you talk about a movie like The Godfather, where it's Francis Ford Coppola, but you watch the movie and you see all these other actors and actresses and you know their names and you know how important they are for things, but you forget about all the people that are working on the back end that aren't actually in the movie itself. With the video games, and you don't even have the actors, you essentially just have these individuals who are very good at interacting in a media environment. But that's a little bit of a tangent. Speaking of other spin-offs, another one that comes to mind, of course, would be the Mega Man series.
All right.
We started with Mega Man X with kind of that darker world. We have those upgradables that were around and that slight bit of explorability to find those hidden upgrades in each world. Then from there, we went to Zero, where we had a little bit of a mission hub environment. Some of this could be seen in Mega Man X6, games like Mega Man X6 as well, where you have that ability to go ahead and rescue the different Reploids that are out there before they're caught by the Nightmare virus.
Right.
Or X5, where you have a little bit of kind of a time limit before these things happen. Zero is a bit of an evolution from there. And then if we take it to the next level with ZX, I kind of like that development of kind of a linear iteration. Once you get to ZX, and you kind of have a little bit of a Metroidvania style of setup, where you have a little bit of a hub world. It's this big sprawling world that you go ahead and explore. And then Legends, of course, is a bit of a black sheep, unfortunately, with the third-person shooter. Please bring back Legends 3, Capcom. Please, I'm begging you.
Please save him from the moon. What was that? Bring him home? Was that the campaign?
Mm-hmm.
X, I thought, was an interesting outlier because you mentioned how you could kind of go out of the way and look for other stuff. You actually saw that in 7, which came out after X, because you had to go out of the way to find Proto Man to get his shield, didn't you?
That's correct.
So it did still kind of influence it.
And I think if we really want to talk about the Mega Man series and starting with that kind of stuff, I want to say Mega Man 5 would be the first real good example where you have to collect the letters to go ahead and have the beat power up. I don't think Mega Man 4 had anything like that.
No, it just had Cossacks, which was definitely a product of its time. But there were some other weird Mega Man spin-offs. I say weird because Mega Man Soccer is a weird concept.
That's true.
And it happened.
Battle and Chase, I guess, is another example. It kind of falls into the interesting category of racing spin-offs.
Should we touch on racing spin-off now?
I think we can go ahead and talk a little bit about something else instead before we get to that one.
We'll go with one of the Nintendo spin-offs because Nintendo does a lot of spin-offs and I don't want to focus on them too heavily. But one of the things I thought was interesting was how they have treated Kirby. Basically since the Game Boy, because even on the Game Boy, they had Kirby Pinball, they had Kirby Super Stacker, they had Kirby Dream Course on Super Nintendo. Kirby has always been what they want to use when they want to try out a new gameplay, but they really don't know how to market it. You can see this with Kirby Mass Attack, you can see it with Kirby Epic Yarn. There's just a lot of small Kirby things. Do you think that necessarily hurts the brand? You've played some of them.
I have, and I don't think that hurts the brand. I think if you look at a series like Mario, then you kind of have a weakness to go ahead and try and do that too heavily. There's a certain amount of tolerance for doing that with some ideas, but if you were to have a truly kind of a off-the-wall idea for a Mario spin-off like Kirby's Dream Course was, that might be something that I think would hurt the Mario brand. For Kirby, where it's kind of been the hallmark of the series since its origin, where it's kind of started off being experimental, I think that's kind of a great legacy to have attached for it. If you pick up a Kirby game and you have some familiar aesthetics in each game, but you have that ability to kind of do something that's brand new from a gameplay perspective and just try something new as when you pick it up.
Now, here's an interesting question. I have played a great deal of these Kirby spin-offs, and I can't think of any that I would consider hot garbage. Now, if there had been one that was hot garbage, would you think that would hurt the franchise as a whole? And as an example, we recently beat Triforce Heroes. and it was pretty consensus that that was not really a Zelda game.
I think that's another great example, though, going back to the Mario point, is that Zelda is a franchise that has such a proven track record of high quality that I think it's very striking to have a game in that franchise that is just kind of a mediocre, average, run-of-the-mill game. It's really not a technically bad or technically broken game. There were some interesting design aspects we had, but the general consensus, as you mentioned, and it was our experience as well, is that you get to the end and you're just kind of left going, well, that was okay, I guess.
The most disappointing thing about Triforce Heroes was there was so much potential for interesting puzzles, and it was just a mediocre dungeon crawler. Nothing really jumped out. Even the challenge missions were just, there's slightly different ways to do the thing you already did. It was never really interesting. I know out of the 8 worlds there was maybe 1.5 that we went, that was done really well.
I think the one that stood out the most to us was the one that made use of the colors of your individual Triforce characters. I believe that was the Ruin one, where you would essentially have enemies and platforms that could only be harmed or affected by the person that had that color of clothing. And we all kind of got to that and went, well, this is what we were kind of waiting for with the last 6 dungeons. It's nice that it finally showed up.
Yeah, it was nice that it showed up. Then that final boss about made us all snap our 3DS in half, because in a game that understood it needed brevity because of the way it was set up, they had, a 4-stage final boss?
That's correct.
Oh, that was ridiculous. We wiped on it once, and had we wiped that second time, I'm not sure we would have beaten it. I actually feel kind of bad for getting you guys to buy that game.
We trusted you and you let us down.
This was one of those examples where you don't want to believe the reviews, because all the reviews said maybe pass on this one. Actually, yes, definitely pass. Unless you have friends, then even still maybe pass.
And I guess bringing it all back kind of the Kirby thing, I think if Kirby were to have a game like that were just kind of a 6 or a 7 of 10, honestly, I can think of Kirby games that would kind of fit the bill like that for me. Like Dream Course and Canvas Curse weren't any that particularly drew me. For a spin-off, then the specific style of gameplay may appeal more to some individuals more than the others.
Yeah, I loved Canvas Curse. That was actually one of the games that got me to buy a DS. You hated Canvas Curse.
I struggled with the controls, and I think that gets into something as well when you talk about playability and for gameplay to just click with individuals. For certain genres and certain styles of gameplay and certain types of inputs, you were always going to have a little bit of just personal preference on what does and doesn't gel with an individual. Did you have any other thoughts on Kirby, Josh?
I just know that Kirby was an interesting one because they took a game that was not meant to be a Kirby game, Epic Yarn in this case, and they tossed Kirby on it because they didn't think the supposed to be main character, who was Prince Fluff in this case, that he would sell the game. So they tossed Kirby in it, and they kind of shoehorned in some Kirby enemies. And you played it. It was a cute game. It wasn't a challenging game.
I really enjoyed the aesthetic. I really had fond memories of playing the game.
I liked it, but I feel like it was, and this is almost a sin saying this about a Kirby game, it was too easy to the point where I kind of didn't care.
I remember some reviews that talked about Kirby games being too easy, Josh.
And that's a very common complaint about them being too easy, but I'm not saying I play games for the challenge, but there was zero challenge in there. You couldn't fail. So what's the motivation to do any degree of good?
Ladies and gentlemen, I was trying to wind Josh up into a little bit of an angry rant there about reviewers, and I applaud him for actually just giving a reasonable, level-headed explanation.
When Yoshi's Woolly World came out, one of the things they noted was the fact you could die in that game. And I'm not saying that every game needs to be Bloodborne, Dark Souls, whatever, but if there's absolutely nothing nipping at your heels, you don't really have a motivation other than what would be a very engaging world. And let's be honest, those Yarn games, not made to be engaging. They're made to be adorable.
Absolutely.
So,
I think one other note, I guess, on the whole subject of spin-offs, we talked about racing spin-offs with Mega Man Battle and Chase, and racing spin-offs are, of course, a very, very common style. The party game spin-off is another very common style. I'm trying to think of other common spin-off styles that are essentially kind of playing it safe. Are there any that come to mind for you, Josh?
One spin-off, we could talk about either of these three for probably the rest of the podcast. There's racing, which you touched on, party, which you touched on, and one that I don't think has proliferated so thoroughly is fighting game. I think deserves to count. Because Smash Brothers, back on the N64, popularized the idea of a cross-franchise brawler.
Smash Brothers is a fighting game?
Oh, buddy. Yeah, all right.
I'll leave the sass behind. Continue.
I'm about
Josh,
to say.
I apologize.
And though it took over a decade for them to get on it, PlayStation Royale All-Stars came out and also had the cross-franchise brawler, which will be the last one they ever have, since I'm pretty sure they dissolved the studio that made that game. Yeah.
We also have Sonic Fighters as an
Oh
example
yeah,
of that.
I forgot about that, but that game looked terrible. Was it any good?
It was okay.
That's...
That's the kind of endorsement that becomes, if you're a Sonic the Hedgehog fan, then it's really not a bad purchase. You could have made worse purchases, like Sonic 2006 or Sonic Boom, Rise of Lyric.
What about those Sonic games on the Wii? I never played Sonic in the...
Sonic Colors was actually... Oh, Sonic Colors was delightful. That was the
Not
one I
that
thought you were going for. Sonic and the Secret Rings struggled with controllability, but other than that was very Sonic. Sonic the Hedgehog and the Black Knight actually improved the controls, but as a game itself was kind of lackluster.
Alright.
Those as well are actually decent budget buys for a Sonic fan. But I guess on the subject of Sonic spin-offs and those kind of common popular ones, they did a racing game with the All-Stars Racing franchise. That was actually very successful and branched out to the broader Sega lore in general. And then you also had Sonic Jam and Sonic Shuffle. What other sorts of common spin-offs come to mind, though, Josh, staring away from Sonic the Hedgehog, which I seem to have on the mind today?
Well, some games just lend themselves heavily to spin-offs, so I don't feel like we should necessarily feel punished for focusing on them too much. Kirby has a ton of spin-offs. Sonic has a ton of spin-offs. If we want to consider it, Mario has a ton of spin-offs.
The basketball games, the tennis games, the golf games.
Well, those are all just sports games. There's also party games. There's also Fortune Street. That was what it was called. I didn't play it because it looked terrible.
I think that was created by Square Enix and pulled from a lot of other franchises. You had some Dragon Quest aspects to that. You had Mario, I think, just because it was on the Wii itself.
Do you consider the Mario RPGs a spin-off?
Absolutely.
So, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is maybe one of my favorite Super Nintendo games of all time. And Paper Mario came from that, was originally called Super Mario RPG 2. It was later changed to just Paper Mario. I think it may have in Japan still been called RPG 2. But even from Paper Mario came Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. So from that one Super Nintendo game, they kind of spun off multiple franchises.
To that point, actually, Josh, let me speak on this first. And Shin Megami Tensei and Persona are a great example of that. When the Shin Megami Tensei series came first, and Persona has reached a point where it has arguably eclipsed the popularity of the mainline games themselves. Shin Megami Tensei at this point is still being relegated to handheld releases, which have lower development costs, whereas Persona is getting a big budget PS4 title. But to your question about what does this constitute a spinoff, I think that's a solid question in and of itself. To me, I would define a spinoff as any sort of game that is taking either lore and aesthetics of a previous game and trying to focus on a specific aspect of those, like Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings with the journey of Vaughn and Penelo, or it is something that is taking a franchise and lore and trying to embark in a brand new genre substantially different than the genre that previously existed in.
The way you phrase what constitutes a spinoff, if a game is already pretty lore light, would you still consider it a spinoff if a game deviated from the gameplay? I wouldn't say didn't have anything in common because there wasn't really much for it to have in common.
I'd describe it as loosely connected. If it has any sort of connection from a lore perspective, like you see a newspaper article in the game and it's making a reference to a previous title by that developer, I think that gets into the fine line between spin-off and Easter egg. So take the famous Uncharted example where it kind of teases about the strain of fungus that's present in The Last of Us.
Yeah.
I wouldn't take that to say The Last of Us is an Uncharted spin-off or that those two have much of a connection. I think that's just an example of an Easter egg.
I would agree with that general sentiment. Did we want to talk any more about the racing game spin-offs? Because there's a lot of those. There's Crash Team Racing, Sonic Racing Transformed, Mario Kart.
Racing games have almost become their own kind of subgenre that aren't even spin-offs. Like you have the Garfield racing thing. It's almost just a vehicle for licensed characters to go ahead and be sold to the masses. Simpsons is a great example. Was there a South Park racer?
There was a South Park racer, but I believe that was on N64. Actually, that might have been a different thing. But yeah, those actually do have a storied history. It's funny.
With that for spin-offs, I really love the idea of a spin-off just because I see it as an opportunity for a developer to try to strike new ground while still retaining some of their fan base, try and attempt new gameplay things, try and focus on new aspects of their lore and tell new stories, show us new worlds. I'm on board with the concept. What about you, Josh? Are you excited when you see there's a spin-off?
I need to see more about it, to be frank. One of the examples, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. I think that is a perfect example because originally it was Metal Gear Solid Rising. And then it went dark. And then, several years later, Platinum said, hey guys, guess what we're making? Then came to light that the game had been canceled. I would consider Metal Gear Rising a spin-off, and I don't think any major Metal Gear Solid fans would disagree with me on that one, because the gameplay's so dramatically different. You still haven't played it, have you?
I have not.
You really should, because I think I touched upon this in one of our last podcasts. It is so fun for the exact reasons that some people hate Metal Gear Solid.
Nanomachines, Josh.
That was amazing. If their tongue would have been any further in their cheek, I think they would have bitten it off.
I think that's delightful about that spin-off for me, is that you have people that try to act like this is some sort of desecration of the seriousness of the Metal Gear Solid lore, as you were giving our friend Brent sass about in the last episode. And if you look at the Metal Gear Solid timeline, and if you really start thinking about characters like Hot Cold Man and Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, this has always been a joke.
And that's the thing about it. They've always been ridiculous. If we look at the first Metal Gear Solid game, you had the psychic guy, you had the Raven Shaman guy who ran around in the cold without a shirt on. Everybody was...
The dominant recessive gene malarkey.
Yeah.
That was delightful. If you had a 7th grade science education, you're like, well, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but okay, let's go with that. We're just going to yell about recessive genes.
We'll just roll with it. So Metal Gear Rising embraced it so thoroughly, and I loved it, and it was amazing.
Wouldn't it be fun to see a Resident Evil game that tried to take a similar kind of approach of just being silly and over the top?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I wrote down, we need to talk about the Resident Evil spin-offs. When Resident Evil Revelations came out, people were not on board with that. They said it didn't take it seriously enough, or yada yada yada. And then you played the early games, and 1 was ridiculous. 0 was ridiculous. They're remaking 2 right now, and you know what I bet's gonna happen? It will be ridiculous. We've talked about this. The games, they're not as good as people remember, so when they make spin-offs like the ill-fated Resident Evil spin-off Dead Aim, I think it was.
I never played Dead Aim. Was that one of the light gun ones on the PlayStation?
Yeah, it could have been a light gun one. I didn't use a light gun, I used a controller. But Resident Evil is a first-person shooter. It almost sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It wasn't. It was really bad.
I'm so sad.
It was really bad and shockingly short. I remember a buddy of mine came over, and this was back in the day when they made games intentionally obtuse so that way they would take super long. We beat it in about 2.5 hours. And it was just super light on the plot. It had redundancy from earlier game. Oh no, Umbrella's being evil and you have to uncover the conspiracy. We can't keep going over this stuff. They did the exact almost opposite of what you said. Was they took a game and they almost used the exact same plot and they put a different gameplay style on it. So it made it unfun, which was really disappointing. But then you had your Resident Evil rail shooters. I never played any of those. I know you played at least one of them.
Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles was fun as a chance to kind of see the series from a new perspective, and that you're exploring it as a rail shooter, and essentially you're just kind of along for the ride doing the shooting action. So you mentioned how it would be fun as kind of a first-person shooter kind of thing. That's what the rail shooter experience was kind of like. It was a nice way to sort of highlight key moments from the series' history. I thought the moments where they tried to do the actual new content, where it wasn't just, hey, this is an event that occurred in Resident Evil 1 or 2 or so on, I thought that was a little bit weaker. I never got around to Dark Side Chronicles, and honestly, I didn't really hear a lot of enthusiasm for it.
Yeah, I don't think I heard anything positive myself. But some of the games, since you were talking about the silliness of Resident Evil, I think they kind of did embrace it and people hated it. Example, Resident Evil 4 putting Leon in the gangster outfit. That was ridiculously hilarious. Especially if you ever saw the clip. If you have the Tommy gun and you go to reload it while you have the gangster hat on, you just adjust your hat. Well, there's a clip online where a guy does the thing after 3 times. He'll throw his hat up in the air, but he set it up so an enemy bit his head off right before the hat came down. And it was hilarious.
That's one of the best videos I've seen on YouTube.
It was interesting that Resident Evil 4 had that silliness, and then Resident Evil 5, you could dress your characters up in ridiculous outfits, but they even had that in 0 and 1 as well. Right. I know in 0 you could dress up as a cowgirl. Yeah, dress up Rebecca as a cowgirl. So they've always had silly costumes, but these are just things people try to forget. They're like, oh, it's so serious.
For Resident Evil and for Metal Gear Solid, I think it's important to keep in mind when you play these things when you're 13, 14, or 15, there's a lot that you're just willing to ignore and not worry about too much. Whereas when you play an adult and you're kind of judging it more critically, then you see certain things that are just undefensible. But to a 13 or 14-year-old, it's just like, wow, this is so cool, man. This is really dark. This is violent. I'm not trying to judge these things because I was like that too. It's just a reality of experiencing it as an adult where an M-rated game or an R-rated movie is no longer a rush.
Oh, God, we're getting old. But let's go ahead and wrap this up. Spinoffs, good or bad?
Spinoffs, good. Chance for studios and publishers to experiment with properties and try and build into a unified lore.
I would also say that I think their safer bet is to usually go with something lower budget and low key, so that way they can kind of test the waters on it.
Absolutely.
That's why I think you see more spin-offs on handhelds than you do on consoles for that exact same reason.
I agree.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, so thank you for coming on, Nick.
Thanks, Josh.
And that is all. We will see you next time on Co-Opinions.